There is a specific kind of fear that the narcissistic structure carries. Not the fear of confrontation. The narcissist has mechanisms for confrontation. Scripts, projections, escalations, the entire elaborate architecture of behavioral responses that have been developed across a lifetime of managing external reality. Not the fear of rejection. Rejection, as Jung observed, can be metabolized within the narcissistic structure's existing defenses. It can be reframed, projected outward, located in the inadequacy of the one rejecting rather than in any failure of the self. Not even the fear of loss. Loss, painful as it is, activates mechanisms the narcissistic structure has always possessed. Replacement, devaluation, the swift reorganization around a new source of external regulation. The fear that Jung mapped with such precision, the fear that sits beneath all of the narcissistic structure's other fears, the fear that none of its defenses were ever designed to manage, is something entirely different. It is the fear of the empath's transformation. Not the empath's anger, not the empath's departure, not even the empath's silence, as devastating as that silence is. The transformation itself. The specific, irreversible, complete psychological reorganization of a person who was once available, unconsciously, compulsively, structurally available, for the narcissistic dynamic, and who has become something that the narcissistic structure has never encountered before and has no mechanism to engage. Someone who has passed through. Someone who absorbed the darkness and came out the other side of it, carrying something the darkness could not take from them. Someone who is no longer recognizable as the person the narcissistic dynamic required them to be. Jung called this individuation completing its first arc. And he documented with remarkable precision why it is the most destabilizing thing a narcissistic structure can encounter, and why the fear it produces reveals more about the architecture of narcissism than any other response the narcissist is capable of. This video is about that fear, about what it exposes, about what it means for the empath who has completed the transformation, and about what Jung observed happening inside both psyches when the transformation is finally, irreversibly, complete. To understand why the empath's transformation is what the narcissist fears most, we have to begin with what the transformation actually is. Not what it looks like from the outside. Not the behavioral changes, the new boundaries, the reduced engagement, the quality of presence that observers often describe as a kind of untouchability. These are symptoms of the transformation. They are not the transformation itself. The transformation in Jung's framework is an interior event of the deepest order. It begins, and this is critical, with absorption. Not with resistance, not with the decision to protect oneself, not with the installation of boundaries or the development of awareness or the accumulation of knowledge about narcissistic dynamics. With absorption. Jung observed that the empath who enters a relationship with a narcissistic structure does not enter it armed with defenses. They enter it through the specific psychological configuration that makes them an empath in the first place. The permeable boundaries, the compulsive empathy, the unconscious tendency to organize their inner world around the emotional states of those around them. They absorb. They absorb the narcissist's projected shadow. They absorb the disowned pain, the unintegrated rage, the fragments of a self that was never fully formed, and that requires an external container to exist in recognizable form. They absorb the anxiety, and the emptiness and the desperate compulsive urgency of a structure that cannot regulate itself from within. They carry all of this. Not because they are naive, not because they are weak or insufficiently aware, but because the architecture of genuine empathy, before it has been differentiated, before it has been paired with the sovereignty that makes it sustainable, is precisely the architecture that makes this absorption possible. The empath absorbs. And something happens in that absorption that Jung documented with extraordinary care. The darkness that enters the empath's psychological system, The shadow material deposited through years of projection and participation mystique does not simply sit there inertly. It does not simply damage the empath and move on. It activates something. Jung called it the alchemical process, the transformation of base material through a process that is simultaneously destructive and generative. The darkness that enters the empath system encounters in the depths of that system the specific psychological materials that, when activated by sufficient pressure and sufficient pain, produce the conditions for genuine individuation. The empath absorbs the darkness, and the darkness, in the precise alchemical sense that Jung meant, begins to transform the empath, not by destroying them, not by filling them with cynicism or hardness or the frozen quality of someone who has been hurt past the point of genuine feeling, by completing something, by forcing a confrontation with the empath's own shadow, the disowned power, the unacknowledged sovereignty, the capacity for self-possession that the compulsive caregiving structure of pre-individuated empathy was organized to deny. The darkness the empath absorbed from the narcissist meets the darkness the empath was carrying within themselves. And in that meeting, in that collision of two shadow systems in the interior of the empath's psychology, the individuation process ignites. What does this ignition look like? Jung was careful to describe it not as a sudden awakening but as a gradual, often agonizing, accumulative process. The empath does not one day decide to transform. They do not choose individuation the way they might choose a course of action. The individuation process is not a decision. As Jung documented across decades of work with patients in exactly this kind of psychological situation, individuation is something the psyche does to itself, and the conscious mind experiences it, initially, as something being done to it. The empath begins to notice that something is changing. Not in the narcissist, in themselves. The absorbed shadow material, the years of projected pain and disowned rage and the specific quality of psychological darkness that only proximity to an unintegrated narcissistic structure produces, begins to surface in the empath's own consciousness, not as the narcissist's material, but as the empath's own. This is the aspect of the transformation that most people, even those who have experienced it, find most difficult to articulate. The darkness that entered through the relationship, through the absorption, through the participation mystique, somehow becomes, in the alchemical process of the empath's psyche, raw material for the empath's own integration. Jung called this the withdrawal of projection, not the narcissist's projection, the empath's own. Because the empath too projects. The empath who organized their entire inner world around the narcissist's needs, who compulsively caregiving and absorbed and managed. This empath was also projecting something. Their own power, their own sovereignty, their own capacity for self-direction and self-possession, which was too threatening, too incompatible with the compulsive caregiving structure to be consciously claimed. The narcissist was the container for the empath's disowned power. And when the darkness of the relationship finally activates the individuation process, when the pain accumulates past the point the compulsive caregiving structure can absorb, the empath begins to withdraw that projection, to claim what was always theirs, the power they were giving away, the sovereignty they were organizing their entire inner world to deny. The self that was always there, beneath the participation mystique waiting. This is the transformation that the narcissist fears. Not the empath's departure, not their anger, not their silence. The empath reclaiming their own power. And Jung was precise about why this specific event, this specific internal reorganization, is more destabilizing for the narcissistic structure than any other response the empath is capable of. The narcissistic structure was never organized around having a relationship with the empath. It was organized around having access to the empath's psychological resources. The admiration, the attention, the absorbed emotional labor, the compulsive management of the narcissist's internal state. These were not the byproducts of the relationship. They were the relationship. The entire dynamic was structured to ensure continuous access to the empath's psychological availability. And that access depended, completely structurally, irreversibly, on the empath not being in possession of their own power. The empath who is not yet individuated is available for extraction precisely because the power that would make them unavailable has been projected outward. They are, in the most precise psychological sense, partially empty, carrying projected contents that belong to them, but that they have not yet claimed, and therefore vulnerable to the insertion of projected contents from outside. The narcissist's projected shadow finds a home in an empath who is already organized around carrying what they haven't claimed as their own. When the empath reclaims their power, when the individuation process completes the withdrawal of projection, and the empath stands for the first time fully in possession of what was always theirs, the home disappears. Not just for the narcissist's projected material, for any projected material. The empath who is individuated is psychologically full, not in the sense of closed or defended or armored against intrusion. Full in the sense that every part of their psychological system is inhabited, owned, integrated, present to itself. There is nowhere for projection to land. There is no disowned power available to be organized around another's needs. There is no compulsive caregiving structure available for exploitation. There is only a person, fully present to themselves, sovereign, and therefore from the narcissistic structure's perspective, terrifying. Jung documented the narcissist's response to the empath's transformation with precision. The first response is disbelief. The narcissistic structure, encountering the transformed empath, initially cannot locate the person it knew. The behavioral patterns that were so reliable, the specific responses that could always be predicted, always be activated, always be used to restore the dynamic to its previous configuration, produce nothing. Not resistance, not suppressed response, nothing. The transformed empath does not fight the behavioral scripts. They simply don't participate in them. There is no surface for the script to catch on, no hook available, no unconscious resonance to activate. The narcissistic structure experiences this as disorientation. The map it has been using to navigate the relationship, the detailed, accumulated knowledge of exactly which levers to pull, which wounds to activate, which specific psychological territories the empath would predictably organize themselves around. This map describes a person who no longer exists. The empath has transformed. And the narcissistic structure, encountering the person who replaced the empath it knew, encounters something it has no category for. The second response is escalation. Jung observed that when disbelief fails to restore the dynamic, when the behavioral scripts produce no response and the disorientation deepens, the narcissistic structure escalates. Not strategically, structurally. The escalation is the automatic output of a system deprived of its regulatory input. Every mechanism available is deployed at maximum intensity. The idealization that previously produced absorption is amplified. The vulnerability that previously produced caregiving is escalated into apparent crisis. The rage that previously produced anxious management is increased in severity. All of it designed to find the response that will restore the previous dynamic. All of it encountering the transformed empath's equanimity. Because the transformed empath can witness the escalation clearly. Not coldly, not with satisfaction. With the specific quality of aware, boundaried, compassionate witnessing that Jung associated with the individuated self. They can see the pain behind the escalation. The genuine distress of a structure encountering the loss of its regulatory source. The structural urgency of a system that has never developed the capacity for self-regulation and is now experiencing the consequences of that absence. They can feel compassion for that pain. and they cannot be moved by it into restoring the previous dynamic. Because the compassion of the transformed empath is not the compulsive compassion of participation mystique. It does not require the dissolution of the self. It does not activate the caregiving structure that organized itself around managing another's distress. It is boundaried compassion, clear compassion, the compassion of someone who can see suffering without being recruited into it. And this, the experience of being seen with compassion that does not restore the dynamic, is more destabilizing for the narcissistic structure than any form of anger or rejection could be. Anger confirms the dynamic. It provides projection surfaces. It generates engagement. Compassionate, boundaried, clear non-participation in the dynamic exposes it. The third response is the one that reveals most clearly what the narcissist fears. Jung called it the fear of exposure. Not exposure in the social sense. Not the fear of being publicly identified or judged or condemned. The narcissistic structure has developed extensive mechanisms for managing those kinds of exposure. The exposure the narcissist fears in the presence of the transformed empath is something entirely different. It is the exposure of what the relationship actually was. The empath who has completed transformation carries in their body and their nervous system, in the integrated wisdom of everything they absorbed and processed and alchemized, a complete and precise understanding of the actual structure of the dynamic they were inside. Not an intellectual understanding, a cellular understanding. The knowledge that comes not from reading or being told, but from having been inside the mechanism and having metabolized it from the inside out. The transformed empath knows what the relationship was. Not as accusation, not as grievance, as knowledge. And the narcissistic structure, in the presence of someone who carries this knowledge, who embodies this understanding in the way that only genuine transformation produces, encounters the most threatening mirror it has ever faced. A mirror that does not reflect back the identity the narcissistic persona is presenting. A mirror that reflects the structure beneath the persona, the actual architecture, the dependency, the inability to self-regulate, the shadow that was being projected outward through the entire duration of the relationship, the void that the empath's psychological resources were filling. All of it visible. Not spoken necessarily, not confronted directly, simply visible in the quality of the transformed empath's presence. The transformed empath does not need to say anything. Their presence says everything. And the narcissistic structure, unable to prevent this reflection, unable to manipulate a mirror it cannot cloud or redirect, experiences what Jung identified as the narcissist's deepest fear. Being seen. Not being judged, not being condemned, being seen. Precisely, completely, without the distorting lens of the empath's previous unconscious participation in the dynamic. Seen for what the structure actually is. Why is being seen so terrifying for the narcissistic structure? Jung's answer to this question goes to the very foundation of what narcissism is and how it functions. The narcissistic structure, as Jung documented, is organized around a fundamental avoidance of self-knowledge. Not ordinary self-knowledge, the kind that involves acknowledging flaws or limitations within an otherwise coherent sense of self. The kind of self-knowledge that the narcissistic structure avoids is more fundamental than that. It is the knowledge of the void, the absence. The place where the relationship with the self would be if the individuation process had not been interrupted. The interior emptiness that the entire elaborate external architecture, the persona, the behavioral scripts, the constant extraction of external regulation, was constructed to keep invisible. The narcissistic structure does not know itself. Not in the way Jung meant knowing, the deep, honest, shadow-integrated self-knowledge of a psyche that has done the work of individuation. The narcissistic structure has a persona, a constructed identity, a set of beliefs about who and what it is. But it does not have a self. It does not have the internal center, the deep organizing principle, the relationship with one's own depths that genuine self-knowledge requires and produces. And it cannot have one, cannot begin to develop one, as long as the external scaffolding is in place. As long as there is an empath available to absorb the projected shadow, to provide the external regulation, to organize their inner world around the narcissist's needs, the void at the center of the narcissistic structure remains invisible, covered, managed from outside. The transformed empath removes the scaffolding, not by confronting the narcissist, not by exposing them to others, not by any external action, simply by no longer being available as a container for what the scaffolding was holding in place. And when the scaffolding is removed, when the transformed empath's psychological availability is permanently withdrawn, the void becomes visible, first to the empath, then inevitably to the narcissist themselves. This is what the narcissist fears most. Not the empath's power, not the empath's clarity, not the empath's boundaries or their departure or their silence. The possibility, held open by the transformed empath's very existence, that the void they have organized their entire life to avoid might finally be unavoidable. Let us now speak about what the transformation costs the empath. Because the transformation is not free. Jung was honest about this, more honest perhaps than most of the frameworks that describe the empath's journey use. The individuation process that the narcissistic relationship activates is real. The transformation is real. The reclamation of power and sovereignty, and the integrated self, is real. But it is purchased at a cost that deserves to be named. The empath who transforms loses something. Not something external. The loss is interior and it is significant, and it is one of the aspects of the transformation that is most frequently underestimated or glossed over in discussions of the empath's journey. What the transformed empath loses is the particular quality of innocence that characterized their pre-individuated state. The specific kind of openness, the unconditional, boundary-dissolving, unconsciously available openness that made them such a profound source of regulation for the narcissistic structure. This does not survive the transformation intact. It cannot, because that openness was not a virtue in the purest sense. It was, in the Jungian framework, a pre-individual state, a natural expression of a psyche that had not yet completed the work of differentiation, that had not yet established the clear boundary between self and other, that makes genuine sovereignty possible. The transformation completes the differentiation, and in completing the differentiation, it changes the quality of the empath's openness. It does not close it. The capacity for genuine connection, genuine empathy, genuine emotional presence, these survive the transformation and become, in fact, more available than they were before. Because they are no longer compulsive, no longer driven by the unconscious dynamics that made them extractable. But they become chosen, conscious, boundaried. And the empath who has transformed will never again experience the specific quality of unboundaried, unconscious, compulsive openness that characterized their pre-individuated state. This is a loss, not only a gain, a loss that deserves acknowledgement, because the empath who does not acknowledge it may spend years wondering why the world feels slightly different, slightly less immediate, slightly more witnessed and slightly less immersed than it did before. Jung called this the price of consciousness. The world does not feel different because something has been taken from the empath. It feels different because the empath is seeing it more clearly. And clarity, while it is liberation, is also the end of a particular kind of innocence that made the world feel more vivid, more immediate, more saturated with meaning. The transformed empath trades that innocence for something more durable, for sovereignty, for the capacity to choose where to place their empathy, for the ability to be genuinely present without being consumed, for the integrated self. But the trade is real, and the cost is real. And honoring that cost, acknowledging the grief of what was lost in the transformation, not just celebrating what was gained, is part of what individuation actually requires. There is a specific question that arises when the empath understands the nature of their transformation. It is a question that Jung's work makes possible to ask, and that Jung himself addressed in his writing with a quality of moral seriousness that is worth sitting with. Did the narcissistic relationship serve a purpose? Not in the sense of having been good, not in the sense of having been deserved or appropriate or anything other than deeply painful, but in the specific psychological sense of having served the individuation process, of having been the catalyst, however brutal, for a transformation that would not have occurred without it. Jung's answer to this question is neither comfortable nor dismissive. He observed that the individuation process uses whatever is available. It does not require gentle circumstances. It does not wait for ideal conditions. It activates through whatever confrontation is sufficient to force the psyche toward greater wholeness. And sometimes, for some psyches, the confrontation that is sufficient is exactly the kind that the narcissistic relationship provides. The prolonged exposure to projection, the accumulated pain of being in a dynamic organized entirely around another person's needs, the specific exhaustion of a compulsive caregiving structure that has finally, definitively, been pushed beyond its capacity to continue. These are not gentle catalysts, but they are effective ones. And Jung was careful to note that recognizing this, acknowledging that the relationship served the individuation process, even as it caused genuine harm, does not require the empath to be grateful for the harm. It does not require minimizing the pain. It does not require forgiving what was genuinely damaging. It requires only the capacity to hold two things simultaneously. The harm was real, and the transformation that the harm catalyzed is also real. Both are true. And the empath who can hold both, who can acknowledge the pain without being organized by it, and acknowledge the transformation without using it to bypass the grief, is demonstrating exactly the transcendent function that Jung identified as the highest expression of the individuation process. The capacity to hold tension without collapsing it. What does the transformed empath carry into the world after the narcissistic relationship? Jung observed that the empath who has completed this specific arc of individuation, who has absorbed the darkness, metabolized it through the alchemical process of the psyche, and emerged carrying integrated power, carries something that is genuinely rare in the human community. Not rare in the sense of being superior, but rare in the sense of being uncommon. They carry knowledge of the shadow that most people encounter only theoretically. The empath who has been inside a narcissistic dynamic, who has been the container for another person's unintegrated shadow, who has felt what it is to absorb projected darkness and carry it as though it were their own, who has lived inside a dynamic organized entirely around the avoidance of psychological self-knowledge. This empath knows something about the shadow that no amount of reading or studying or intellectual engagement with Jungian concepts can produce. They know it from the inside. And this knowledge, Jung observed, is not merely personally valuable. It is, when the individuation process has been completed and the knowledge has been integrated rather than merely accumulated, a contribution to what he called the collective unconscious. The empath who transforms does not only transform themselves, they carry in their transformed presence a kind of witness to what human psychological development looks like when it is forced through the specific crucible of the narcissistic dynamic. They embody the possibility of transformation, not as proof, not as example, as living evidence visible to any psyche that can perceive it, that the darkness can be absorbed and metabolized, and that something more whole can emerge from the other side of it. This is what the narcissist fears most about the empath's transformation. Not just the loss of the regulatory source, the transformation itself, as a living refutation of everything the narcissistic structure is organized to believe. The narcissistic structure is organized at its deepest level, around the belief that the shadow cannot be integrated, that the void at the center cannot be faced, that the individuation process is impossible, that genuine self-knowledge is impossible, and that the only available response to psychological emptiness is the constant, urgent extraction of external regulation. The transformed empath contradicts this, not by arguing with it, not by confronting the narcissist with evidence, simply by existing as someone who was inside the darkness and came through it, someone who absorbed what the narcissistic structure cannot face and survived it. Someone who integrated what the narcissistic structure insists cannot be integrated. Someone whose very presence suggests, without a word, without a confrontation, without any act directed toward the narcissist at all, that what the narcissistic structure fears most is not in fact unavoidable. That the shadow can be faced, that the void can be met, that the individuation process, on however brutal the catalysts, does not destroy the psyche that moves through it. It completes it. Jung returned always to the question of what is possible. Not what is easy, not what is comfortable, not what is deserved. What is possible. And what he documented across decades of work with psyches of every kind, including psyches organized around the avoidance of their own depths, including psyches that seem to have foreclosed on the possibility of genuine self-knowledge, is that the individuation process is always available. The narcissistic structure is not beyond it. The shadow can always in principle be integrated. The void can always in principle be faced. The relationship between the ego and the self can always in principle begin to develop. What the transformed empath's existence offers, not as a gift, not as an intention, but as the simple structural consequence of having completed their own transformation, is proof that the process works, that the darkness does not win, that something more whole is possible. The narcissist who encounters the transformed empath encounters this proof, whether they want to or not. And the fear that this encounter produces, the specific, deep structural fear of a system encountering the living refutation of its own foundational belief, is the most honest thing the narcissistic structure ever produces. Because it is not performed, not strategized, not deployed. It is the narcissistic structure's own shadow, pressing toward consciousness, activated by the presence of the one person it could never prevent from transforming, the empath, who absorbed the darkness, and became more whole because of it. This is what the narcissist fears most. And it is, Jung would observe, the most profound thing the empath carries into the world once the transformation is complete. Not the absence of the narcissist, the presence of themselves. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to breathe, and remember that awareness grows when it's shared. Subscribe, so you don't lose your way when the next reflection arrives. Leave a like. It helps this message reach others who need to hear it but don't yet know why. And share your thoughts below, because every comment here becomes a spark, one awakened mind helping another remember. Together we move beyond the dark.